You're standing in your kitchen, reaching for a bag of salt or a box of pasta, and you don't think twice about the physical effort required to get there. It's a 3-second journey across a level floor. But if you were standing in that exact same spot 200,000 years ago, that simple act of reaching for a resource would have been the climax of a month-long survival ordeal. Back then, there was no floor, no roof, and no certainty that the resource you were looking for even existed. You were a biological machine designed for one thing: the relentless, grinding pursuit of the horizon. You didn't have a map, a compass, or a guaranteed destination. You just had a pair of legs and a brain that was hardwired to wonder what was on the other side of the next hill. That impulse, that irrational, dangerous need to keep moving, is the only reason you're standing in that kitchen today. We are a species of professional trespassers. We didn't just inhabit the world, we forcibly occupied it, one agonizing step at a time. And the story of how we did it isn't a story of brave explorers in ships. It's a story of blisters, bone-deep exhaustion, and a series of technological breakthroughs that turned the entire planet into a neighborhood. The story begins roughly 1.8 million years ago with an ancestor called Homo erectus, which, for the record, is the first time in history a creature looked at a distant mountain range and decided it was a personal challenge. Before this point, our ancestors were mostly homebodies, sticking to the familiar patches of forest and savanna in East Africa. But Homo erectus was different. They were the first to develop the long, lean limb proportions we recognize today, turning the human body into a highly efficient heat exchange system. They had the ability to run long distances in the midday sun, a time when every other predator was forced to hide in the shade to keep their brains from cooking. This was our first great transportation technology, the ability to sweat. By dumping heat through our skin instead of panting, we could outlast any animal on the plains. We weren't faster than the antelope, but we were more persistent. We simply walked them to death. This endurance was the fuel for the first great migration. Fossils found at Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia show that Homo erectus had reached the gates of Europe and Asia nearly 2 million years ago. They weren't riding anything. They weren't sailing. They were just walking at a steady 3 miles per hour, decade after decade, pushing the boundaries of the known world until they had spanned 2 continents. But as these early pioneers moved, they hit a wall that should have been the end of the story: the ocean. Which is a polite way of saying that for a land mammal, the sea is essentially a giant, do not enter sign. For a long time, researchers believed that ancient humans were trapped on whatever landmass they happened to be standing on when the sea levels rose. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a discovery on the island of Flores in Indonesia changed everything. Archaeologists found stone tools that were at least 800,000 years old. Here's the problem: Flores has never, in the entire history of the Earth, been connected to the mainland. Even when the ice ages were at their peak and sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, there was still a deep water trench at least 12 miles wide separating Flores from the nearest land. You cannot walk 12 miles across the ocean. You cannot accidentally drift that far on a single log and survive to start a colony. This means that nearly 1 million years ago, a creature with a brain half the size of yours looked at the open water, realized it was an obstacle, and built something to beat it. We don't have the boats, wood and bamboo rot away in the tropical heat, but we have the tools they used on the other side. This was the birth of the maritime tradition. It wasn't about luxury, it was about the realization that the horizon wasn't a boundary, but a bridge. As we move forward to roughly 70,000 years ago, the pace of this journey shifts from a slow crawl to an all-out sprint. This is the era of the Great Expansion, where modern Homo sapiens began the final, decisive move out of Africa. Which, if you're looking at a timeline, is basically the moment we stopped being just another animal and started being a global phenomenon. By this point, we weren't just moving to find food, we were moving because we could. We had developed complex language, which allowed us to pass down mental maps from one generation to the next. A grandfather could tell a grandson about a river he had seen 40 years prior, and that grandson could find it. This was the invention of data-driven travel. We see the evidence of this in places like the Bacho Kiro cave in Bulgaria, where 45,000-year-old remains show humans were already well established in the heart of Europe. But they didn't stop there. They pushed into the frozen wastes of Siberia, a place so cold that your lungs can burn just from breathing. To survive here, transportation had to become about more than just legs. It had to become about clothing. By inventing the bone needle and tailored fur garments, we turned ourselves into walking microclimates. We carried our environment with us. This allowed us to treat the most hostile terrain on Earth as a highway. This brings us to one of the most incredible "how did they do that?" moments in human history, the arrival in Australia. Around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, humans reached the continent of Sahul, which included modern-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, which, just to be clear, required crossing a stretch of ocean known as the Wallace Line, where the currents are so strong they act like a liquid fence. This wasn't a 12-mile hop like the one to Flores. This was a 60 to 90-mile voyage across open, treacherous water. You cannot see Australia from the shores of Indonesia. These people weren't just paddling toward a visible target, they were navigating based on the behavior of birds, the patterns of the swells, and the color of the clouds on the horizon. They built sophisticated rafts, likely out of giant bamboo or bundles of reeds, and they did it with the intent of finding something new. Genetic evidence shows that this wasn't a one-time fluke. It was a planned migration involving hundreds of individuals. While the rest of the world's megafauna was still grazing peacefully, humans were already mastering the physics of buoyancy and current. We had conquered the land, and now, we were beginning to claim the sea as our own territory. But while the southern groups were mastering the waves, the northern groups were facing a different kind of challenge: the bridge to the New World. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that a massive plain emerged between Siberia and Alaska. This wasn't a narrow bridge, it was a 1,000-mile-wide tundra known as Beringia, which was less of a bridge and more of a lost continent that only existed for a few thousand years. For a long time, the standard theory was that humans waited for the ice to melt and then walked down a narrow corridor into the heart of North America. But recent finds at sites like Monte Verde in Chile, which dates back over 14,000 years, have blown that theory apart. If people were already at the bottom of South America that early, they couldn't have walked through the ice corridor. It wasn't open yet. The more likely reality is much more impressive: the Kelp Highway. These ancient travelers were likely hugging the coastline in skin-covered boats, moving from one rich kelp forest to the next, harvesting seafood and finding shelter in bays that are now hundreds of feet underwater. They moved faster by sea than anyone could have moved by land, skipping over the glaciers and populating an entire hemisphere in what was, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. As the ice began to recede and the world warmed up, the nature of travel underwent its next massive shift. We had reached every corner of the globe on our own 2 feet or in hand-carved boats, but we had hit a physical limit. A human being can only carry about 50 pounds for an extended period without destroying their joints. This meant that for 95% of our history, you were limited to what you could fit in a hide bag. But around 15,000 years ago, we signed the most important contract in history. We domesticated the dog, which, despite what your golden retriever thinks today, was originally a high-performance utility vehicle. In the Arctic, dogs were the key to the entire transportation system. By hitching them to sleds, humans could move hundreds of pounds of meat, skins, and firewood across the ice. A sled spreads the weight over a large surface area, allowing it to glide over snow that would swallow a human leg. This was the first time we successfully outsourced the labor of movement to another species. It changed the math of survival. Suddenly, a small family could move their entire home in a single day. This wasn't just about speed, it was about capacity. The dog sled was the heavy-duty truck of the ancient world, and it allowed us to stay in the most brutal environments on Earth by giving us the power to haul the resources we needed to stay warm. But the real revolution, the one that would eventually lead to the car you drive and the plane you fly, happened on the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Roughly 5,500 years ago, a group of people known as the Butai, living in what is now Kazakhstan, did something that would change the shape of every map on Earth. They domesticated the horse, which is a bit like upgrading from a moped to a jet engine in terms of raw power. Before the horse, the fastest a message or a person could travel was the speed of a human jog. On a horse, that speed tripled. In terms of accessible distance, the world suddenly shrank by 70%. We know the Botai were the ones to do it because we found their pottery with traces of mare's milk, and their horses' teeth show the distinct wear patterns caused by bits. But the horse was more than just a ride. It was a weapon and a trade tool. It allowed the Yamnaya culture, a group of steppe herders, to explode across Europe and Asia, spreading their DNA and their languages further and faster than any group in history. Most people in the world today speak a language derived from these horse-riding nomads. The horse turned the vast, empty plains from a barrier into a highway. While the horse was conquering the land, the people of the Pacific were pulling off the greatest feat of navigation in human history. Around 3,500 years ago, the Lapita people began pushing out from the Bismarck archipelago into the deep Pacific, which, if you've ever looked at a map of the ocean, is mostly a whole lot of nothing punctuated by tiny specks of rock. These weren't coastal sailors, they were blue water explorers. They developed the outrigger canoe and the double-hulled voyaging canoe, which were essentially the Ferraris of the ancient sea. These boats were fast, stable, and capable of carrying dozens of people, along with pigs, chickens, and crops. Without a single piece of metal, without a compass, and without a written language, they successfully found and settled almost every habitable island in the Pacific, from Hawaii to Easter Island. They did this by reading the pulse of the ocean. They could feel the way an island thousands of miles away disrupted the rhythm of the waves hitting their hull. They looked at the stars not just as lights, but as a giant, rotating map. By the time the first European ships staggered into the Pacific, the Polynesians had already been master navigators of that ocean for over 2,000 years. They didn't discover the islands. They knew exactly where they were because they had the technology to find them. And then there was the wheel. It's funny to think about, but the wheel is actually a very late invention in the human story. We had already reached Australia, North America, and the furthest reaches of the Pacific before anyone thought to put a cart on an axle. The oldest known wooden wheel was found in the Ljubljana marshes of Slovenia, dating back about 5,200 years. Which, when you consider that we've been walking for 2 million years, makes the wheel a very recent software update. The problem with a wheel is that it's useless without a road. On a rocky hillside or a muddy forest, a wheel is just a heavy circle that gets you stuck. This is why the wheel didn't really take off until the invention of the spoked wheel around 2000 BC by the Sintashta culture in the Ural Mountains. By replacing a solid slab of wood with a light, strong rim and spokes, they created the chariot. This was the first high-speed vehicle. It combined the power of the horse with the efficiency of the wheel. Suddenly, you didn't just have transportation, you had an industry. You needed engineers to build the chariots, trainers to handle the horses, and most importantly, you needed governments to build the roads. The wheel forced humans to organize their environment. It was the invention that paved the world. When you look at this chronological march from the first sweat-drenched steps of Homo erectus to the high-speed chariots of the Bronze Age, a pattern emerges. Each breakthrough wasn't just a way to move faster, it was a way to bypass a biological limit. Sweat bypassed the limit of heat. Language bypassed the limit of memory. Boats bypassed the limit of geography. Animals bypassed the limit of muscle. And the wheel bypassed the limit of friction. We spent 2 million years trying to figure out how to be somewhere else. We treated the entire Earth as a puzzle to be solved, and every time we hit a wall, we built a tool to climb over it. We are the only species that isn't satisfied with where we were born. We are defined by the distance between where we are and where we want to be. And that distance has been shrinking ever since the first person decided that here wasn't good enough. Today, we move at speeds that would be physically incomprehensible to our ancestors. We travel in pressurized tubes 7 miles above the Earth, eating lukewarm meals while we cross entire oceans in the time it takes to watch a few movies. We complain about a 20-minute traffic jam as if it's a personal insult from the universe. We have become so good at traveling that we've forgotten that travel is actually an act of defiance. Every time you get in a car or hop on a plane, you are utilizing a million-year-old legacy of refusal. You are refusing to be limited by your own legs. You are refusing to let a mountain or an ocean tell you, no. We have conquered the planet so thoroughly that the horizon has nowhere left to hide. We've mapped every inch, paved every valley, and bridged every strait. We won the war against distance. But in winning that war, we've lost something fundamental to our identity. There is a specific kind of silence that you only find when you're walking through a place where no one else is. It's the silence our ancestors lived in for hundreds of thousands of years. It's the silence of knowing that if you want to see what's over that next ridge, you have to earn it with every breath and every step. We used to be a part of the landscape, now we just pass through it. We see the world through a window or a screen, moving so fast that the details blur into a gray smear. We have traded the intimacy of the journey for the convenience of the destination. We have everything we ever wanted, the ability to be anywhere, anytime. But as we sit in our climate-controlled boxes, hurtling toward a horizon we no longer have to fear, we might want to remember the people who started this journey. They didn't have shoes, they didn't have maps, and they didn't have a plan. They just had the horizon. And the horizon is a very hungry thing. For nearly 2 million years, the rule of human life was simple: move or die. If the seasons changed, you moved. If the water dried up, you moved. If you wanted a better life for your children, you started walking toward a place you had only heard about in stories. That pressure, that constant looming threat of extinction, is what forged our brains and our bodies. It made us clever, it made us resilient, and it made us incredibly dangerous. We didn't colonize the world because we were peaceful explorers. We colonized it because we were the most efficient survival machines the Earth had ever seen. We were the species that looked at an ice age and saw a bridge. We looked at 1,000 miles of open water and saw a challenge. We have spent our entire existence running away from the limits of nature, and now we finally have. We are finally free from the tyranny of distance. But nature has a funny way of making sure you pay for every shortcut you take. We have built a world where movement is effortless, but in doing so, we've made ourselves sedentary. We've built a world where we can communicate instantly, but we've never been more isolated. We have solved the problem of how to get there, but we've forgotten why we wanted to go in the first place. Your ancestors didn't walk across continents so that you could sit in a cubicle and look at a screensaver of a mountain. They walked because they were looking for something that we have since buried under layers of concrete and steel. They were looking for the edge of the world. And the irony is that now that we've finally found it, we realize there's nowhere left to go. The world has grown small, and we are still the same restless, wandering primates we were 2 million years ago, looking for a horizon that no longer exists. Think about that the next time you're annoyed that your flight is delayed or your GPS takes a second to load. Think about the millions of people who lived and died without ever seeing what was 50 miles away from where they were born. Think about the sheer, terrifying bravery it took to point a bamboo raft into the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no guarantee of ever seeing land again. We are the descendants of the ones who didn't turn back. We are the children of the ones who kept walking even when their feet were bleeding and the stars were unfamiliar. We carry their restlessness in our DNA, a ghost of a migration that never really ended. We are still moving even when we're standing still. We are still searching even when we have everything. We are a species of travelers who have finally run out of road. The Earth was once a vast, terrifying mystery that could swallow you whole without a trace. We turned that mystery into a map, and that map into a grid, and that grid into a cage. We mastered the distance, we tamed the wild, and we paved over the ancient paths our ancestors carved into the dirt with their bare feet. We have finally reached the end of the long march that began in the Rift Valley 2 million years ago. We are the first generation in the history of our species that can go anywhere without having to risk a single thing. We have won the world, but in the silence of the night, when the machines stop humming, we can still feel that old, primal urge to keep moving. But there are no more bridges to build, no more oceans to cross, and no more horizons left to conquer. We have finally arrived at our destination, and we are realizing far too late that the journey was the only thing that actually kept us alive. The road has ended, and the cage is locked from the inside.